Hello, and welcome to Movies We Dig, the podcast about film, antiquity, and everything in between. I'm Christy Vogler.
I'm Elijah Fleming.
And I'm Colin McCormick.
And today we're talking about Romulus, an Italian historical drama television series created by Matteo Rivere. And to do this, none of us, I feel, really specialize in prehistorical Rome. So we went to the amazing authors of the book Rex, The Seven Kings of Rome, and they're going to help us discuss season 1. So today, joining us from Australia, we have doctors Fiona Radford and Peta Greenfield, also known as Dr. G and Dr. Rad, from their own history podcast, The Partial Historians. Welcome, Fiona and Peta. It's good to have you.
Hello.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Yeah, so this was a pleasant surprise of a series. It was we're covering Rome on the small screen and trying to pick out some stuff. I looked up top best TV shows about Rome, and this little gem was hidden amongst that list. And we're going to start off as we usually do. Can both of you tell us if you dig this and what your history with the show is overall?
I loved it, actually. I can't believe that I've waited this long to watch it. I really only watched it because we were coming on this podcast, because we've just had so many other things going on at the moment that committing to a TV series just didn't seem on the cards. But yeah, I absolutely loved it. And I think I may be in love with the main actor.
A little bit, yeah.
That's fair.
Here we go.
I'm crushing on Ilya. I gotta say, I'm crushing on her hard.
Those cheekbones, her
I
jaw.
know.
Oh my god.
And her hair, just to so good.
Look, I'd have to say that I dig this very much. I did watch the first season a little while ago, probably a year or so ago, and have just started watching season 2, and I'm not far into season 2. But I really enjoyed season 1, and I ended up watching it on the recommendation of a friend who's also an ancient historian, who were like, have you seen this? And I was like, I don't have time for television. I'm a very busy human. And, I'll put it on my list, which is what I say to everything. My list is kilometers long, and I've taken nothing off the list. But eventually I got around to it because it was available in Australia on a streaming service, which is not a premium one. So it was free to air, which was fantastic for me. And I really enjoyed the way that they took an innovative look at the foundation story of Rome and made it their own in really particular ways. And there's lots of scope for play, I think, in that period of history, because we've got archaeological records of sorts. We've got a little bit of writing, but we don't have historiography. So there's lots of space for imaginative exploration. And as soon as there's vestals in anything, I'm like, oh, I'm in. Totally in.
I think I tweeted I'm not sure we'll talk more about Rex or Vestal Virgins in this, because they popped up in the first episode. I'm like, well, we're definitely going to be chatting about that today.
It's a dangerous topic for me. I'm not going to
lie. Colin, Lige, what was your impression of the show?
Yeah, I really agree. I was so surprised at how much I was really enjoying this. I remember a year ago when we couldn't access it in the US for a while. I kept trying to find it, and it always led me down very deep, dark internet rabbit holes that I didn't want to go down. And it was now finally sort of streaming on a free service here, which was awesome. And I do remember when I heard they're like, oh yeah, they speak Latin the whole show. I rolled my eyes. I was like, really? Do we have to? But I actually really enjoyed their language. I enjoyed the way that they used it. And I don't think it was detracting from any part of the story. I think it actually added something a little bit. And I really enjoyed maybe familiar faces in new ways and sort of a different take on the narrative that we all think that we know. So all in all, I really enjoyed it, and I really dug this season for sure.
I think I'm a bit cooler on it than everybody else, but as I was thinking long and hard, I think a lot of the reasons my sort of frustrations are actually not with the show itself, and more just a general sort of fatigue with prestige television sort of generally, particularly now having watched multiple seasons. And then it takes a lot for one of these kinds of historical dark period pieces to really jump out to me anymore. And so I think part of the reason, part of it is, I think maybe I just came in with like an impossibly high bar for the show to clear that it wasn't going to ever do. And that's my fault, not the show's. Although, but I say by the end, I have thoughts about sort of how this show is positioning itself sort of in history and myth and tradition and things like that. Cause it definitely takes some big swerves from the sort of traditional narrative that, you get in, say like a Roman history class. But at the very end of that first season, when the season 2, hit next episode, I hit that button immediately. So
Yeah, right?
it enthralled me to some extent. I'd be lying if it said it did nothing for me, but I have some, we'll come back around to sort of what I think the show is doing.
But
generally, that's a sort of, that's a light dig from me.
Considering the genre that it seems to belong to, as you were just talking about, I actually was expecting a lot more gratuitous sex.
Mm-hmm.
Not like I was disappointed, but just in the sense that I actually thought that they could have gone more down that, because that seems to be part and parcel. Like, it gave me very Last Kingdom vibes in some ways.
Sure.
Yes. I was
Yes.
thinking the show. I was thinking like one of my first notes is like, man, Vikings has really like spawned a whole genre, right? Of like, this is very much of. That was the show I was thinking. Then there's another thing that I think this is, but
yeah, and given what those shows are like, I was expecting a lot more gratuitous sex, particularly after one scene that happened quite early on with Romulus, and I was like, here we go.
Yeah.
But it didn't really go there. So I was actually like, restraint, respect.
Yeah. there was an orgy, but
I was
it
like,
was
one
tame in
cave
comparison to
orgy,
Spartacus.
One cave orgy, but come on. I mean, what's a TV show set in archaic times if it doesn't have one cave orgy?
maybe it's just me, but I'm not into the mud or like it was too much dirt.
Too much of that.
And that's how you know Colin's not an archeologist.
Well, I don't know, man.
Sex in the dirt.
They solved the issue of the drought, and then it rained for the whole season. And so inevitably, it was a little bit more muddy than you might expect if they were going through a dry spell.
Yeah, maybe it's not usually like that.
Yeah, Colin, it's a good thing when the earth is wet, okay? Just
Cave orgies aside, wet earth is good.
Yeah, I don't know where we even want to kind of start off.
We should probably contextualize it because I imagine most of the listeners probably have not heard about this show and are learning about it probably for the first time from us. But to that end, the show is a retelling of the Romulus and Remus origin myth for ancient Rome, right? The myth about the twins, sons of Mars, raised by a she-wolf, come back and they depose their evil father-in-law, or sorry, evil uncle or granduncle.
Yeah, granduncle.
And found the city of Rome. But the show itself kind of has a couple of sort of main lines. There's the character of Remus, who I assume is our Remus surrogate.
Yeah.
That was my question as well. I was like, this is how I'm lining them up. And
Yes.
I wondered if everybody else was lining those up as well.
He's sort of closest to the original myth, where he is the grandson of the king of the city, Alba, and then his wicked granduncle usurps the kingdom and exiles him, and so he goes into exile. There's also the other main character, Wiros, who I am assuming is our Romulus surrogate, who is a former slave who basically is in this kind of Lord of the Flies initiation ritual, and then they end up falling in with this sort of clan of the cave bear tribe living in the woods. And the third major storyline, so you have, Remus and Wiros with the Cave of Wolf people, and the third major storyline is Ilia, who is the Vestal virgin who was in love with Yemos. Also, I forgot to mention, Yemos had a brother who was murdered, and
Anytos.
then Anytos, and then Ilia was in love with Anytos, and then Ilia basically has a religious experience, for lack of a better word, and then is now on the warpath to avenge Anytos' death, which brings everybody on a collision course for a power, for, a Game of Thrones type of situation. But yeah, did I miss anything?
Oh, that was a great summary.
Yeah, that was pretty good.
Excellent.
Yeah, very succinct for an entire series.
I guess we could just add that Ilia is the daughter of Amulius, King Amulius, who has usurped the throne and killed Anytos but said that it was Anytos's brother who killed. So Ilia thinks she's going for, oh gosh, all the names are flashing.
Yemos. She's going in for Yemos.
Yeah.
Also, was she so she was dating her cousin or second cousin or first cousin?
Cute.
No, second cousin.
Grand cousin?
These are small communities, Colin. It's fine.
Also, not okay for a Vestal.
Dating seems like
Also,
a generous term
Vestal
for it.
version might be the bigger problem.
That might be the bigger problem, yeah.
Yeah, they were like, holding hands between a grate once a month or something.
They've loved each other since she was 6 years old. Cute.
Apparently.
Yeah.
Very sweet.
Yeah, I'd love to tell the teenagers that I know that this is what dating is. You know, you see each other once a month. You don't actually see each other. It's at night. It's dark. Nobody knows. And you just hold hands for like a few minutes and then undying love will result.
And the plan was Anytos was holding out for her. They were going to wait till her terms of service was up, right?
Yep.
Something, you know.
Yeah, she only has like another 16 years left, apparently. So she's going to be, something like that. So, or maybe... Yeah, okay. No, she's 16. She's supposed to be 16 in this series. So she's got another 16 years to go, but they've been together for about 10, according to being in love since they were about 6. So this is long-term serious.
Yeah, that's commitment.
It is. Yeah.
They don't make them like they used to.
I officially really dig this one too. And a lot of it is... Ilia is a lot of it, and we'll get into why later. But I did want to read like a little excerpt from your guys' book, Rex, because like I feel you point something out that I think this show did really well with. So you guys wrote like on page 1, and yet Rhea Silvia's dream, a story that foretold the rise of Rome, often remains untold, overshadowed by the story of fratricide. This book explores the Roman kings, but it would be a mistake to forget that young men are born of mothers, and mothers have their own stories to tell. And I loved that line because I think that's really true of like the Iliad is, if we think about that, like that is a story that was probably orally passed down by survivors of, you know, this sacking of a city and something like that, and that it was probably women telling those stories because women are enslaved, women are expected to produce children for conquerors, and that's how a lot of these stories are probably preserved, but we always have men's names because they're the ones who wrote it down. So I kind of wanted to ask, do you guys think this series or this season did a good job of bringing that to light, that like the women were just as important to the founding of Rome as the men we know?
Yeah, definitely.
I'll let Dr. G jump in on this because with the Vestal involved, I just know that she's itching to say something about that.
Look, I think the Vestal angle is a really interesting one in this series because it's pretty clear that the gods are central to everything that these early people are doing in this series. So whenever a decision needs to be made, at least in the city of Alba, they're going to consult either the Vestals or the Haruspices. It would seem that these are the two major priestly groups that are active in this region. And so Ilia has a really prophetic dream quite early on in the season where she's sure that Anytos is going to be killed by his brother Yamos. And this is a huge problem. And Anytos is like, my brother would never kill me. But within the context of the cult of Vesta, there is a suggestion that dreams are a way that gods speak to people. So the dream needs to be taken seriously. And so he needs to reflect on that and consider what he does next. And this sort of sets up a tension for him because he's like, okay, the gods have given me some sort of signal. How do I interpret that? And his way of dealing with that is then to consider running away from the city to prevent the possibility of his own murder. So there's a sense in which women's actions and the ways that they interact with the menfolk have implications for the broader politics. And I think the other way that we can see this really strongly is in the story arc of Gala, the wife of Amulius, and the way that their relationship really takes on a Lady Macbeth sort of.
Yes.
Absolutely.
I had that exactly in my notes.
I was like, wow, this evolves fast, guys, because she really transitions from being an incredibly powerful female figure. Because when we first are introduced to her, she's walked in on one of those rare sex scenes that we get in this season. Amulius
Yeah.
having a bit of a threesome. And she is completely unfazed by this, that her husband would be sleeping with other women. And she just sort of sends those women away and then sort of takes over into the space sexually. And you get the sense that she's the really driving, ambitious force in that relationship. And she's the one who plants the seed of ambition, which is then reinforced by other men in Amulius's life. But he kind of gets it from her. And then as the whole sequence of their power play unfolds, things really spiral for her. And she starts to really accept that her role in this has not been great. And I think that mother-daughter relationship between Ilya and Gala is a really interesting one to see play out on screen as well.
Yeah, I actually wasn't even sure for the first couple of episodes if she was a stepmother.
I
or whether
questioned
she was
that
her
too,
actual
yeah.
mother. Yeah, because I was like, she's giving me vibes like me as a stepmother. So I'm like, am I sensing a kindred spirit?
Yeah.
Yeah, but you knew she was evil because she was wearing way too much eye makeup compared to Sylvian.
I was about to say the eyeshadow to wickedness ratio was very telling
and
with
dark
her.
colors, whereas Sylvia's always in those like earth tones or the Alban kind of reddish colors, you know.
So costume plays a big part. That's for sure. I do like the sort of, you mentioned Vikings earlier, and you see the nod to that in all of the hairstyles as the characters become increasingly warrior-like. They become more Viking-like in their hairstyles. And I was like, I'm here for this. I like this.
It's so elaborate. 100%. I'm like, how do these people know how to do it? I can't do my hair like that.
I know. There are inserted pieces, guys. Nobody has that much hair. There's got to be like a little bit of foam underneath that they wrap the hair around to make the braids stick up like that.
I know. I was just like, this is insane.
Eli and Christy, I wonder if you were going to comment on the women's armor, the sort of the perpetual women's armor needs to have that exposed midriff.
It's
every
Inner
time.
Warrior Princess.
Every time.
Yeah. But man, she looked good.
To be fair, like Wiros and Yemos are also like running around half naked with like no armor on. And I think like Wiros for a while just has like a strap with like a tiny vertebrae on it. And I was like, great, that's super protective, wonderful. So like in terms of the scale of like how protective is my armor, like Ilya might be okay.
This is true, Yemos. Yeah, as Yemos gets ready for war, he actually wears less clothing, not more.
Like throws off the like fur, whatever he's wearing. And I'm like, all right.
Throws that off because we don't want to miss a second of that ab action while he's fighting.
In comparison, though, might I say that when we get to Deftri, who's one of the warriors of the children of Rumia, she's basically wearing nothing. She kneels down at some point and you're like, that is a string holding this whole thing together, girl.
She's got the Gollum loincloth thing going on.
And she's supposed to be quite a fierce warrior. So I have concerns about the level of armor, but nobody's got very much. Like the Albans have like a little square breastplate that does not cover everything. But might help you
really
if somebody
preventing you from doing CPR. I mean,
if somebody goes for your sternum, you're going to be safe. But apart from that,
well, considering that they're ripping everyone's hearts out, maybe that's a good spot.
Yeah, I had to imagine that kind of maybe the whole plan was that this is obviously meant to be an archaic time. Would people in this time period have had super effective protective armor? Probably not. You know, so I was kind of okay with it because I was like, look, I know that you're shamelessly trying to show off these actors' bodies, etc. But to be fair, I don't know that they would have been running around in amazing armor, you know.
So true. Yes.
I gotta say, one thing I really loved about the show, because it's based in this archaic period, because for a minute, I paused when they were describing when they were in the forest for, I think it was the Lupercalia, they called it eventually. And they were saying like Rumia has claws of iron. And I had to like stop and think for a moment. It's like, is there iron here right now? Because they're also using stone tools. They're flint knapping. They do have like bronze as well. And it's like all of these different technologies are present. And that might not seem correct on the surface, but I think we forget that those class differences, what you have access to is what you're going to use. So all of those boys thrown into the forest, obviously, to go through this initiation, right, have to pull on skills for flint knapping and creating weapons out of raw materials. And the more wealthy you are in the position of king or something like that, you're going to own a couple of things. You're going to own weapons, either of bronze or iron, and you're going to have a horse. And oh my God, there was one beautiful horse that like the splotchy black and white one that like brought the body back to the veil.
Yeah, that was a good one.
This is beautiful. I don't know why. It just caught my eye.
I thought that splodginess was to do with the paint that they'd put on that horse.
Too. Yeah.
I wondered, is so pretty. I don't know. Sorry. I did horseback riding when I was a kid. So I'm like, it's so pretty. Okay. But I thought that was so cool. Like the other thing I geeked out is when we meet the Greek potter and we see a pottery workshop. And I'm like, I am so in love with this little moment of seeing like the young boys are the ones like using their feet to stomp the clay, and you're seeing the crushing and different people having roles. I'm like, this is so cool. Like, you don't get to see a prehistoric or protohistoric period representation. And, I'm not sure how accurate all of it is, but I thought they did a really good job in a lot of ways.
I thought so too, actually. One of the things that again, like along the gratuitous sex line that I made earlier, I felt like they didn't really go over the top with costuming, hairstyles and makeup perhaps aside, but that's always, in historical film, TV, makeup and hair is always the thing that's going to be probably the most anachronistic. But yeah, in terms of costuming, housing, the way they set up, the various villages that we see, I didn't feel like they went over the top in making them seem overly grand, overly wealthy. I mean, even Amulius's, and I guess Numitor's, main residence, it's nothing particularly fancy by, modern standards. And what they're wearing is, okay, it's obviously a cut above what like the average person you're seeing is wearing, particularly in terms of the colors and that sort of thing. But I actually thought, again, they were being quite restrained. And even in the final scene, and I'm sorry, spoilers for anyone who hasn't got to the final episode, when Yemos turns up at Alba Longa with his allies, he's like, I've got 500 men here. And I was like, that's so small.
Right?
Yeah.
That's nothing.
But
but that's probably more accurate. Yeah.
Like that would be a lot of people to raise from the surrounding areas for sure.
Yeah,
and when we look at
exactly.
And within the context of the sets that they've created, we can see that they've created, Alba seems to be a small sort of hut of villages, like a village of huts with a fence. And you're like, that, but it seems to be the most preeminent place within the sort of kingly structure that's diplomatically playing out in the background. So they've got this idea that there is a league of kings and the king of Alba is the leader of the league. And he definitely has the nicest city as far as we can tell. We get glimpses of the neighbors. There's Gabby that we see quite a lot of, and we also see Velia a little bit. And those two places seem to be second tier in terms of like what they've got architecturally. And Alba is not offering much, as you say, Dr. Rad. Like Amulius's palace, if we can call it a palace, is basically a hut that's got maybe 3 rooms.
Well, I was going to ask, so you mentioned Gabi because that's an archaeological site today. And I found myself trying to find, like, do we have an archaeological like layout for Gabi? Like what it looked like? Because like that was a particularly meager sort of, it was really just like a collection of spread out huts. And the whole thing, it reminded me a little bit of, I imagine they were probably looking to the quote unquote hut of Romulus, the settlements in Rome or buildings. Maybe there's a Iron Age hut on the Palatine Hill. That's, Romulus's hut. And I wonder if that was a sort of visual touchstone for the set design.
Yeah, look, I imagine so. There seems to be a reasonable fidelity to what we know of things that have been reconstructed from that period based on the evidence. There's not a lot of evidence, though. That's the tricky part. We're talking about 8th century BCE, basically. And so if it is in stone, that's incredibly significant. It's a real marker of power. But chances are most things would have been wood or other materials that probably haven't made it through. And I'm sure you guys can speak to that far better than I as archaeologists. So I'm just a mere historian. So, yeah, I think there's a sense in which when you look at it, it feels to me as a historian watching it that they've done a pretty good job of trying to create just how small these places were We're talking about extended family clan groups living together in a region and deciding to settle. And how do they make that work? And the sort of politics that extends out of that from being a small city-state, city being in the quotation marks because we're not talking about heaps of people, but people all in one place, then going and talking to other people. And we do get a hint that there is an Etruscan settlement of Veii, which is nearby that people know about, which is much bigger and has real walls and like more people than you've ever seen, which is one of the things these merchants talk about at some point that Yemos and Weros encounter. So there's this far off distant idea of civilization, but it's not happening where these people live. Where these people live, it's much more of a struggle. And the idea that the Velian youth have to go into the forest for this massive 6-month initiation rite where they need to survive in the forest to prove themselves. And if they come back early, they'll get killed by their own people is intense as a way of thinking about
a lot.
Yeah, like how do you survive in this world? And it's like, well, you got to learn how to live in the forest.
Yeah, it's we also this week covered The Name of the Rose, which was a movie based in 14th century
Italy.
Yeah,
I remember Christian Slater. Yeah,
and it's like
Okay, sorry, quick pin. Christian Slater, hot or not?
Not my cup of tea. No.
All right.
Thank you.
This is just a question that I'm vetting everybody because this has been under much.
It's an important question now.
People thought yes, like
those people were wrong.
Yeah,
correct.
Look, he had the flippy hair that was very popular, in that time. The Leonardo DiCaprio Titanic era, haircut.
He was an early model for the the model that Leo would perfect.
Yes.
But sorry, Christy, I cut you off.
Well, I was just going, it's like, man, patriarchy really does suck for men because that's kind of the problem, right? And you see this historically too of like, you can't actually have too many men who inherit land. So you got to do some things to cull them, either send them into the forest to like get rid of some of the weaker ones or just have them all live communally in an abbey together. And I'm like, yeah, it's kind of funny, like how often that is a problem, right? Like, how, like you just have too many men inheriting land, and you got to get rid of them. The Greeks send them to, it's like, go make your own city. Bye.
How do you solve a problem like patriarchy? There's a song in there somewhere.
Definitely.
Well, two thoughts. Speaking of sort of toxic masculinity, the first couple episodes are basically like Lord of the Flies, where you just get this like incredibly vicious environment in this survival situation where the biggest, toughest, basically bully Nias kind of takes over and he's the sort of king of terror over these other boys. But back to the Romulus myth itself, right? That is a myth that's the story is so sort of, there's a lot of like male angst in that story because one of the first, Romulus and Remus in the myth or versions of it, they're kind of like leading these like basically bandits, like they're kind of like bandit kings for a while. And then they make their city. And the first problem is they have no women because it's all exiles and criminals from other places around. That's like kind of the foundation. That's their first group. And then I'm getting ahead of myself, but we're going to meet the Sabines in season 2 of the show. But the first thing that Romulus needs to do, or does rather, is kidnap a bunch of women.
Yeah, I wonder how they're going to maintain his heroic status.
Right.
Have you seen have any of you watched ahead? I've only gotten a couple of episodes.
I have not watched ahead, no.
I think I'm in the same spot as you, Colin.
Yeah, they do it. The Sabines are, in fact, the villains of season 2.
Of course they are.
Well, that's where Amulius goes, so I'm not too surprised. I'm also not surprised Amulius got snuck out. Like, that felt very in line.
Yeah, as soon as Ilya, so again, spoilers, sorry for anyone listening, but yeah, as soon as Ilya was about to kill her and father, and then it cut to black, and then you just see her with the blood on her hands, and she makes a big declaration, and just the way she's, just her facial expressions and all of that kind of stuff in that last episode, I was like, she didn't do it. No. And then, that last scene being, as soon as I saw the hooded figure, I'm like, there he is. There's Amulius. Son of a bitch, he's managed to escape again. And the fact that he's obviously heading off to the Sabines, that I was like, okay, so this is where we're going. All right.
Yeah. No, I do really like the world building just in kind of encompassing all of these things in that it feels so big. And when you have like this small communities, you know, these sort of extended family groups that are city-esque, we might say, it does feel like a big world. And like we, in our modern day with our Google Maps, know so much about the world. But yeah, if you run into the forest and you're like, there are crazy spirits in the forest and some people don't survive on their own. It's like that's a real thing. That's not just like a weird, you know, superstitious, they scare themselves. That's real. There are people who live in the forest and there are people you don't understand and there are people who don't speak the same language as you and you don't know where they came from. And I love that like uncertainty about this whole world because it feels very realistic in that terrifying kind of small way.
So I think one of the interesting things about the children of Rumia that we run into in the forest, these weird, somewhat savagely positioned people who worship the wolf and seem to not really have a particular place to live, but have settled in a cave. They identify themselves as Oski somewhere in this season. And I think that's fabulous because we do know that we've got these different language groups that are happening in central Italy in this period and beyond it as well. They continue on. These languages don't die out for a long time. So the Oscan people are from sort of the southern central part of Italy and extend up to the north on the eastern side. And they kind of surround what will be Latin territory in some respects. And the Sabine people are considered to be part of that language group as well for a long time. So the idea that we're not just dealing with people who are strange, but we're dealing with different language groups, we're dealing with different cultures. The idea that sort of underpins a lot of this season is the fear of foreign gods. Like, how do we negotiate foreign gods? We've got our gods, and everybody's pretty clear that gods belong to particular places.
Yes.
So there's like the Albans have their gods, the Gabi have their gods. We don't see too much of that, but the implication is there. And then the idea that Wiros and Yamos have become part of this wolf cult through the virtue of having to survive with them produces a lot of tension for particularly Yamos's family, who was like, oh, I don't know about this wolf guy, you know. You sure? Not sure Jupiter's keen on this. Yeah.
I mean, that is a very Roman sentiment. There are episodes in the historical Roman period where they are introducing foreign gods or gods are coming into Rome, like the cult of Bacchus or Magna Mater and things like that. And the Romans have a very sort of tendentious relationship sometimes with these foreign cults, particularly if they practice behaviors that the Romans are not too keen on, like having eunuchs or public, nudity or dancing, or in this show, eating people's hearts.
That old chestnut.
Just a casual snack,
Just a little heart now and then.
Got to get your protein somehow.
Yeah.
But yeah, religion is so central in the sort of consideration, which feels, although many of the specifics of the show are fabricated or, are original to the show, but that the sort of that anxiety and that tension feels real.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say actually about the way that this show has taken a bit of a departure and yet at the same time feels very real. Because the interesting thing I think about this series is that the guy who's obviously like the main sort of showrunner, I guess I'm going to call him, he did also direct, I think just prior to doing this series, a movie about the Romulus and Remus myth, which actually takes a much more traditional storyline as far as I can tell, because in typical fashion, it's been impossible to get a hold of that particular movie, but I'm just basing it on what I could find online in terms of the storyline. So it is interesting that in doing this more drawn out version of the story, he's taking a different approach to the story. But one of the things about his history on film is that generally what the people who are making it are trying to do, and they're trying to get an authentic feeling, not accuracy per se. And I feel like a lot of the things that they do, like, yes, the Lupercalia seems to have taken on like crazy proportions in terms of having to last for 6 months. And, they've obviously taken perspectives on where the name of Rome comes from and, all of that kind of stuff. But it's the vibe that seems right to me. So the fact that they depict Rumia as this aggressive, protective kind of deity, and and the way that they interpret the she-wolf, that all kind of makes sense to me in terms of the overall vibe of what Rome itself would later think itself to be. And the way that they keep having those lines where they're like, everyone will speak of our city. It'll be on the tongues of everybody. Like it's obviously that foreshadowing. And so it does, it is a bit of myth making, obviously leaning into the myth making around Rome, what the Romans would have liked to think of themselves. But it kind of makes sense to me.
And I don't think we should lose sight of the fact that this whole thing was shot in Lazio, just outside Rome. So, we're in the landscape. They're in the place where all of these stories have been told and continue to be told. And there is a huge investment culturally in appreciating and understanding these stories in more depth. So,
yeah, and hats off to the actors for delivering those performances in this freaking archaic Latin that they devised for the show. I mean, oh my God. I can't even imagine.
I really, really thought that it would detract from like the actual performance. I was expecting the worst, and I feel like this was a best case scenario for using a weird archaic version of Latin, because it felt familiar, like it was fun when I could understand or hear things that I recognized, but it also worked with the story and with the characters instead of just kind of being weird and added on at the end.
It was definitely embraced, it seems, pretty early on.
Yes.
I wonder from an acting perspective whether they had a parallel script so they could get a sense of the emotional beats they had to hit with certain lines. Because I was like, oh, look, if you had to learn some sort of weird archaic Latin in order to do this, I think that would be really tough.
I do wonder, as being most of them are also Italian speaking actors, I do wonder if that helps a little bit, if you have
I can only presume it did.
Sort of familiarity.
I would probably imagine many of them had years of Latin.
Yeah, the design behind having this language was that Matteo Rivere wanted the language to sound ancestral to the Italian audience, I believe. So,
yeah. Oh, that's beautiful.
I think that's cool. Yeah.
So there was something I kind of saw with the religion, and it's juxtaposed with a lot. It goes back to the Lupercalia and Gnaeus. And it goes also to the transition we see of Wiros and his people as the outsiders of Alba. And what it was interesting to me is that the children of Rumia were representative of, and I don't want to use we would say primitive, right? But they were actually much more communal, egalitarian. And that's why I thought the Sabine woman situation was kind of funny, because it seemed like just as many women fighting with the men, and there was no, there was no issue with Ilya. It's Mars doesn't come to women, and she's like, well, he did to me. There's not that. It's we fight for our survival together. We fight for each other, for the pack, and that was really cool. And it's juxtaposed against the 30 kings and what the rule of that is like. And when the group from Lupercalia finally banded together against Gnaeus and he had to go off, they also didn't fare much better, right? They forgot how to live communally without a big person taking charge. And then, so I was going to ask, what did you guys think of the scene when I really liked her. She was the sacred albino woman who died, and she had been the voice of Rumia, and then Wiros all of a sudden claims, now I'm the voice of Rumia. And you have this transition from a female speaker for a female goddess to someone who is masculine and now being called a king as well.
Yeah, and I think you can probably pair that with when Yemos says that the she-wolf is in him.
Mm-hmm.
It's that similar, these two very central female figures who are absorbed into both Wiros and Yemos at slightly different times. Yeah.
Oh, look, I think it's fascinating, isn't it? So we've got this idea of this matriarchal kind of setup, because it's very female-led. There's a couple of men inside the children of Rumia who do speak up and have really particular roles, but they're not the leaders of things. It's definitely the she-wolf, and she's an incredibly powerful figure. And the sacred one who, is fed very well and is involved in prophesizing and all of that sort of stuff. So to see that sort of transition and the masculinization of that cult in the service of those people being able to have their own city. So that, in a way, the underlying sort of tension there is the position of cities as masculine places and the forest as a kind of feminine space to be feared, particularly under the conditions of something like the Lupercalia. So dangerous. Women, scary. yeah.
And even they were scary in an awesome way.
Yeah. And even that transition of Ilia, where all of a sudden, so she goes through this ritual very early on in the season where it's decided she needs to be buried alive. And you're like, oh, great. Bound to happen. And you're like, and then somehow she emerges from that. And really, she shouldn't be able to get out of that chamber. And I'm not sure that I believe Amulius's version of events. I feel like there's potential that might be, the thing he says about it might not be true. But she emerges from that and then pursues a different divine figure. So there's this idea of the earth as being able to have that chthonic capacity for change as well, where it's like, well, now I need to do something different. And I'm just going to get a little bit Vesta nerdy for a moment. But the way that they position Vesta is as the threefold goddess, which I was like, oh, I love that. That's not a thing. And I was like that's cool, but what? And there's this really beautiful sort of way in which they draw in kind of neo-pagan ideas about Vesta now standing in for the three-form goddess, the one that represents the maiden, the mother, and the crone, and that kind of sequence, which has an appearance across a lot of European cultures and beyond that as well. But I think what we're seeing is the way that these ideas feed into each other and change over time, because then I was put in mind about Robert Graves's The White Goddess and his work trying to tie together all of those ideas of the three-form goddess and her capacity everywhere in all cultures through all time. And so we don't get a pantheon of gods in this series that includes a lot of women. Vesta seems to be the only one. We get a mention of Jupiter. We get a really strong storyline related to Mars. And then we've got the idea of Rumia, but she's foreign. So within the context of what is happening in these Latin-speaking territories, it seems like there is a predominance of masculine gods and a hint towards the goddess. And Vesta is special, but she does everything. You're like, oh, interesting. Yeah. So they're building a world that feels both familiar as a historian in some respects, but also familiar from the ways in which myth and religion have been analyzed really across like the sort of 19th and 20th centuries as well.
Yeah, the Rumia children feel very much akin to kind of like Gaia feminism theories of, an idea of a sort of matriarchal or matristic society in a pre-agricultural that gets replaced by agricultural patriarchy. But it's also, I wonder if also part of it is a little revisionist too, because if you get into the second season, kind of when they first go meet the Sabines, Yemos and Wiros actually make a big point about how everybody in Rome is actually equal and the women are also with us, which feels more of a projection onto archaic Rome than much else, because most of the women in early Roman myth and stories are in very sort of limited capacities and roles, and often just sort of are wives, and bad things very often happen to them.
Sure.
But before, I want to say, Eli, I know you have to go imminently, but I wanted to give you, if there's anything you wanted to get out there in the world before we...
Yeah. So I'm going to go back to just like Wiros and Yemos as kind of two, because in the beginning they talked about the twins when they were both alive as two halves of the same whole.
Yes.
And then one of them is killed, and Yemos has this kind of like almost existential crisis of like, what do I do? And he, has this kind of suicidal conversation with his the ghost of his twin, and Wiros steps in and kind of saves him from that. And throughout the rest of the season, I feel like they kind of they almost step into like two different like roles that Romans would love. Like Iamos is very like battle heavy. He's on the quieter side, but he's like very honest. Like that's something that they say a couple times is like he doesn't talk a lot, but like you wouldn't, you don't know him if you're questioning his, truth telling or something. So he's very like on the battle heavy, I don't know, just
the strong and silent type.
The strong and silent type.
You have like the warrior and the priest, right?
Yes, yeah. And then Weiros is much like he does sort of get more battle-y, but he is much more on the talking, thinking, trickster side of things. Like even at some point, Iamos is like, you can convince people of something. Like, how would you do this? Like, I'm coming to you for help. And like his power is in his speech much more than in like the sword. So we have kind of this two halves of this Roman whole, or at least that what might become a Roman whole, of like the conniving, speaking politician almost, I want to say, or like a proto-politician.
Or like a Numa and a Tullius Hostilius.
Oh my gosh! Oh my gosh! Weird. But I appreciated that they didn't try to, I don't know, make them both be good at both things. Like I appreciated that they had these strengths and that they complemented each other in this way, and that they seem by the end to really see that in each other. And if we're like going down the story that we as historians know in our head, maybe there will be tension in the future and we're maybe going to be looking for cracks in that relationship. And I think that as a narrative is so much fun.
Yeah, we've already seen the manipulation of the signs from the gods, right? With the idea is like, actually talking's not going to work this time. We need to look as if the gods are speaking. So they go and hunt down 30 little like piglets.
How the hell did they do that in one night?
We only have until dawn.
Breeding season should be about then. So when they give birth,
Thank
whatever.
God it was piglet season.
That worked out. See, the gods did want it. They, it's like, you guys got to work for this a little bit. We're not just going to hand you everything.
Yeah. We'll make the piglets. You put them in the right spot.
Yeah, exactly.
I think the interesting thing that you sort of highlighted there, I think as well in terms of their characterization, is that I think we have also seen as well that Weiros is by far the more hot-headed, emotional one. And Iamos definitely has a temper, but is absolutely able to catch himself before he does anything that he's going to regret. Like when he's first meeting the 30 kings after he's been sort of, rediscovered after his little foray in the forest. And they start talking to him, saying he's a fratricide and blah, blah, blah. He's obviously about to completely lose it. And then he catches himself and he says, you know what? You're right. You don't have to endure my presence if you don't like it. I'm just going to step back here. Wait for you to come to, your senses.
Well, so this kind of leads me to my grand thesis of this show, which is because there's many points when I was watching where I wrote down so-and-so is acting like a totally chill, insane person, where particularly Ilia, but also Amulius and also Wero, everybody, everything's dialed up. And, part of that is maybe the genre of it all. But my sort of thesis is that this show really, to me, reads more like less of like a Roman myth and actually more of like a Shakespeare play that never was. Like it feels like a lost, because we were just talking with Name of the Rose about sort of missing text. It feels like a missing Shakespeare play, which then led me to that the thing that this show is really most riding on is Robert Eggers' The Northman, and that is like a gritty, hardened, real, metal take on Hamlet. That this is like kind of an invented Shakespeare about Romulus, that it's going with that Vikings aesthetic, right? Where everybody is painted up and it's raining all the time and everybody's chopping each other's heads off. But it's like plot, everything about the plot feels like a Shakespeare play.
Oh, yeah. Like I love the setup with the twins initially. And you're like, we're meeting the twins. And then you're like, not very far in. You're like, oop, we've lost the twins. This is a problem, guys.
I was like, Enitos? Why is he called Enitos?
Amulius and Gala are doing Macbeth like the whole time, because it's all about how they, that his crime leads him to his paranoia and eventually, knowing that he's out of line with the gods. It all feels incredibly Shakespearean to me. So that's kind of my thesis on the show. It's not a Romulus story. It's a take on Shakespeare. But
Yeah,
That's
like the
fun.
emotions
That's
are
fine.
always like riding high. And I get the strongest Shakespearean vibes, I think, in the scenes with Ilya, where she gets to do all those moments where she comes out before an army and she's like screaming orders and, talking about how she's half man and half woman and what are you going to do about it? And
Going with Ilya, because as I said, she ended up being my favorite character. And there was a couple of, I have an interesting interpretation of her. And there's a reason that I like her a lot as a character, as a female character in particular. So the first is I really liked the point that a lot of the goddesses are absent. You have Vesta, you have Rumia. And what I think is interesting is I almost thought of Ilya as a follower of Mars came to represent Aphrodite, the lover, or Venus, the lover of Mars. And that's why her costume had to be slightly sexy. You don't have the full cover, but it wasn't,
Well, everybody's costume has to be slightly sexy.
Right,
Just,
right. But she also fierce, right? I would call that outfit fierce. It wasn't
Yes.
I'm here to seduct you. It's my body is awesome, but it's here to kill you, basically.
Yes.
Is kind of the vibe I got from her. And we see the trend, at the very beginning, she's much more modest as a Vestal Virgin in appearance. And once she's gotten her vengeance, so to speak, once she's resolved kind of her problem, she goes back to kind of the more modest outfit. She's no longer associated with Mars. Yeah. And why I like her so much is that she is angry, but her anger isn't out of hand. And I think this was best shown with the other woman, Pola, the wife of one of the leaders that she was trying to get information from.
Kind of crucified.
Yes. The wife of Rufus.
Rufus, yes. Oh, Rufus. And because there's a character from Spartacus named Navia, her whole shtick is vengeance to the point that she's blinded. She causes a lot of problems because she's just out to get everyone that got her. Versus Ilya's anger is much more focused. And the one time that it gets out of hand, she apologizes to the son of the man she killed. She's like, I own up. I'm accountable for this thing that I did. But she's not heartless. She has not lost her empathy for other people and in the pursuit of her vengeance. And I feel that's so rare to see of a woman being righteously angry, but not for the most part taking it on people who don't deserve it. And I think that's why I love her character so much. And I think her response to Pola is saying your love is what saved your husband Rufus. It's still kind of that little tie to Mars of war, Venus of love, and those are both forces that she is encapsulating as a single person.
Yeah, I think they do a good job of making her a well-rounded character. She seems to be a real person driven by real motivations, and her quest for vengeance is justified, certainly in the sense that she's going through immense amounts of grief through the loss of Enitos, and the powerful ways that then she negotiates with that. Her willingness to confess to her mistakes. So fronting up to Lausus to be like, look, I killed your father, Ertas. I did it in cold blood. I thought I had all the information I needed. I was wrong, turns out. That's a pretty big thing to do. And considering what she's already gone through, having endured the sort of ultimate punishment for a Vestal and all of that kind of stuff, to come out the other side of that and still be willing to not just be about vengeance sort of does make her a more complex character. And I think suggests that she's progressed past the arc that the priest of Mars, Attis, has been on, because he doesn't really ever leave the cave of Mars. He stays there. It's almost like he's stuck in that vengeance and he can't get past it. And it doesn't matter how many people he's killed or the flow and effects from that. It hasn't satisfied his vengeance at all.
And he's not forgiving when she goes to him and says, I acknowledge you were right. I was wrong. I left too soon. I'm not quite ready for this. He / Mars, I guess, is like, look, this is not a place of forgiveness. Tough luck. you missed your window. Out you go.
Toodles, girl.
Yeah, but I actually love the fact that they have, because for those who don't know the myths as well, we have several names that are given for this mother of the twins who supposedly made a Vestal and then either gets raped by Mars or somebody else, maybe even Romulus, is rumored in one version. But the one who ends up giving birth to these twin boys, Romulus and Remus, she is given several names, and basically they've kind of used those names and split their stories so that we have Sylvia in this version, who is the mother of Enitos and Yemos and the daughter of Numitor, but she's not a Vestal and she has not been raped or anything like that. Instead, it is Ilia, the daughter of Amulius, which is another name that we're given for the mother of Romulus and Remus. So I kind of like the fact that they are, once again, playing with the elements that we know, but using it to forge a slightly different story to what we've been told in like Livy and that sort of thing.
This show is so smart. I love it.
Yeah, it is. Like, it really, really does play with a lot of stuff that we, kind of know. And I think the reason why I'm also okay with it is because even the Romans themselves, like if you read the accounts of Livy and Dionysius, they completely acknowledge the mythical nature of the material that they are dealing with at this point in time. And it's kind of like when people get upset about the movie Troy, in that it's how upset can you get about a myth? It's already, even in the versions that we have that go back as early as possible, it's already a story. Like, we already know that it's not 100% accurate to whatever happened, if any of this stuff even happened in the first place. And so, I mean, if you read someone like, I think Timothy Cornell says this, they don't believe Romulus was a real person anyway. So why are you getting upset about the way that they are playing with the material that they have? Because ancient people would not have been, I don't think, as precious about playing with elements of a myth and providing a new take on a story.
And that's what's cool about the show, right? There is no Romulus. No one is named Romulus or even close to Romulus.
It's true.
Oh,
this is true.
just you wait.
Yeah. Oh, no. Okay, well, I could see that shift happening, but I liked the idea that it's like, well, actually, it comes from this goddess and all of this. But, that's the effect of myth making.
I think maybe the reason I kind of like the show had such a high bar to clear is I'm really kind of jaded and I'm a little over the trope of like a show or a movie starting and then it's first sort of the text over black is something like, this is the true story. And that for me is usually a huge kind of turn off because I get really fixed. I'm like, why do we care that it's the true story or the real one? And this larger impulse a lot of modern media has to sort of rationalize everything. And I feel like we have a whole subgenre of films we cover on that are this exactly of, right? Like this is the rationalized version of myths X, Y, and Z. Because I think a lot of times when media does that, it's very actually disingenuous. Because if this show is anything, and maybe it's a little more true to life, but it's a huge departure. And it feels odd because it almost seems like the decision to put it in Archaic Latin is to give it that kind of authority or that sort of, that it's more sort of authentic than, something else. But the story is really just, it's running and it's doing its own thing with the story entirely. And so I was thinking to myself, the only movie where I forgive it for saying this is a true story is Coen Brothers' Fargo, where that is actually just a lie that the movie tells you at the beginning, which I think is very interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do just sort of wish that the show dispensed with the notion that this is actually the true story.
That's interesting. I didn't think that the series necessarily made a claim to truth at the beginning. They certainly position it as being like, this is the 8th century. So they kind of like, they locate it in a time period for sure.
Yeah.
And they talk about like war has been ongoing for a while. There's a huge problem with the fact that it hasn't rained. This is seen as a significant issue. There's some sort of rupture with the gods going on. And that's all pretty clear. I feel like, yeah, there is a sense in which it's kind of understandable that this is not necessarily attempting to be the story.
Admittedly, I may have just Mandela affected that there was this is a true story because I just sort of, I'm so conditioned by shows like this to make that kind of claim that I might have just assumed I saw it.
I mean, to be fair, you make a good point with the language, the setting, and all the things I gushed about archaeologically. Even the inclusion of the Greek Potter family and them taking a moment to tell the story of Ajax versus Odysseus.
I love that
it is really meant to try and ground this as if it had happened. And, I was thinking along those lines too. It's like, I really like this version of the story. And in like 1,000 years from now, will this version coexist with the older?
With Livy, right? Yeah.
Exactly. And like people choose the versions, right? Like,
I mean, I would argue that they
time.
should. And that Disney's Hercules is just as much of an entry into the canon of Hercules
It
as
really is, yeah.
Sophocles.
And I think if this was your first encounter with these kinds of stories from this period for Rome, I think this would be a really interesting starting point because it sets up a lot of ideas that are really useful to keep in mind. The fact that we're not dealing with a cohesive society, there's lots of difference geographically, there's lots of disagreement. It's not at all clear who's going to be preeminent. And there is the idea that there are the things that you can know and be sure about, and then there's the things that you absolutely cannot be sure about. And the role of the gods in this world, incredibly important to how you navigate your decision-making process. The way Amulius loses it with the priest when he finds out that the sacred birds have died during the night. And the priest is like, nobody went to this cage. Nobody has touched these birds. This is a sign. And Amulius is like, bullshit. So there's that sense in which everybody at all times is in this sort of tense relationship with priests as well, and people who claim to be spokespeople for gods because they want the sign that they want. And Wiros seems to be clever enough to really lean into that in the moment where unexpectedly and tragically the sacred one dies. And like, what a moment. And you're like, wow, what are the chances? It must be a sign.
Wiros, you killed the oracle, man. That was my reaction when you did. I'm like, Wiros, you killed it. You killed the prophet.
You're like, this is a disaster, Wiros.
I was between like, maybe she, besides albinoism, along with that, it seems like she experiences
epilepsy, right?
Like seizures of some kind. But also a strong possibility is smoke inhalation, because they just came out of a burning forest. And I was like waiting for a couple people to die from that part of it.
Peta, you just sort of prompted a question in my head because it sort of, as you were talking, I was thinking one of the levels that the show seems to be operating on is the presumption of a familiarity with the story. Like it is a counter text in a way that like it presumes that you are at least notionally familiar with Romulus and Remus, which also makes me doubly wonder particularly for Italian audiences who I would assume are very familiar with the story and so would be very clued in and very attuned to the changes that the plot is making and the other things going on, that it's a very postmodern text in a way because it is a response to something, as we were talking, like, should we consider it or would we consider it in the sort of canon with Livy and Dionysius? But yeah, right. Does this require a sort of preconceived notion of Romulus to sort of make sense with?
I must admit, I was actually really sorry. You go, Dr. G.
No, you go.
I was just going to say, I was really confused for the first few episodes about Wiros and his character. Like so there's this moment, for those who haven't seen the series, where the Lupercal have this band around their arm, which they are all wearing, and there's this whole storyline of Wiros being accused of having stolen someone else's, and he is insistent that he hasn't, and it all blows up, and it winds up with him being in prison, and it turns out he has stolen it and he's eaten it. I was just like, I don't understand the motivation for this. Like, I might be missing something here, but I don't really understand why he wanted this thing in the first place. Like why he was willing to almost die for it. Like, I don't really understand this. And so for the first few episodes, I had no idea that Wiros was going to become the kind of Romulus character. I had no idea that he was going to become such a significant figure. I could not figure that out at all. It was not until much later in the series that I suddenly was like, oh, okay, this is where we're going with it. So even for someone who's familiar with it, like maybe I was just being blind because I was often watching this very tired, but I was just like, I did not see that coming at all.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I think the first time that I saw it, I was like, what's up with this Wiros character? And I was like, he's a bit deceitful. He seems a little bit on edge. He's clearly come from a pretty rough background. It's not at all clear that he should really even be in the Lupercal, right, to be honest. And this sort of places him as this sort of ultimate outsider figure. And you're like, I wonder how this is going to work out for this guy. And I think it's only about halfway through the season where you're like, oh, wait a minute. We're getting some strong homoerotic relationship now between Weiros and Yemos. And it's like, well, boys, I think you found your new brother.
Yeah, the eye contact between them sometimes, I'm like, whoa.
Why was there not more gratuitous sex, you ask? I don't know.
I think it's also interesting because, like, my confusion with Weiros also has to do with the way we code heroes or like protagonists, right? Because he's not overly attractive for like a lot of the characters we see. Yemos is who I imagine. Like, I'm like, if I was going to pick a Romulus figure, that's him.
Yeah.
I mean, first of all, rude, but
I'm sorry.
No, but it's true. I must admit, I thought the same thing. Weiros is, let's face it, kind of on the scrawnier side. He's not a warrior. That's made very clear. And he looks really young and kind of boyish, which kind of makes sense if he's going through, I mean, the Lupercalia is obviously positioned as like a rite of manhood, which is not exactly, I think, what we think it was really about. But for that reason, I thought maybe he was just going to be used to show the greatness of Yemos or something, or, you know, that he was just going to be like this like wounded little baby bird that Yemos took under his wing or something along those lines, or, you know, some sort of like Robin to the Batman that is Yemos. But yeah, it as the show went on, I was like, but he does start to become a bit more masculine, I think, in the way they dress him, in that they give him that huge fur to wear so that his shoulders are really like bulked out and that sort of thing. And he started to just look more grown up somehow. I don't know how, but
he did. Yeah. And in season 2, he gets a glow up as well, or he's definitely more sort of masculinized, for lack of a better word.
This is for Dr. Rad, but I think you guys will appreciate as well. He might be the Augustus to Yemos's Agrippa.
Ooh.
Yep, that checks out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense.
The deceitful, clever one versus the military powerhouse.
You know what? It actually does, again, like in terms of the authenticity of it, in that obviously it is, yes, an interpretation, but it's giving me, you know, interesting vibes. I can kind of see with his whole character arc how he is actually a perfect Romulus figure, you know, because he has lied, cheated, stolen, murdered, tricked, as well as honored, you know, loved, been hurt. He just kind of has a more varied experience than Yemos in that sense. And if we are going with the whole storyline of Romulus and Remus having this youthful bandit king, forest dweller, you know, sheep stealing kind of experience before they take on their destiny to found this new city, it makes so much sense for Weiros to be from that background and to have that kind of crazy loyalty to people who are similar to him and see them as being the future, I suppose.
Yeah.
Christy, you mentioned like setting him up as ultimate outsider, which I think is very much the kind of guiding principle with the character. As I'm getting ahead of myself, but again, in the sort of season 2, they're very much positioning Rome as supposed to be this sort of welcoming place for people who are dispossessed or in between or not accepted in other places. And it's this sort of refugee, which is, you know, a nod to one of the things Romulus supposedly does in Rome. He sets up the asylum where people can come and, well, our guests probably know way more about this than me, about what the asylum like is and supposed to be. But yeah, as like a guy who would create an asylum.
Yeah, definitely. And I think this is where the written histories that we do have for this period are really helpful, because they set up a lot of these ideas, which this series leans into in ways which I think offers a way into a type of truth. It's not that the show itself is presenting the truth, because we know that, well, we don't know. So we can't possibly say. But the way that it pulls on the threads of the story that we have from source material when it's written down finally by the Romans allows them to weave together something that feels really coherent actually in this first season. So that sense in which it makes sense that they would set up a city of asylum. One, they've got to find a place for the children of Rumia who won't just be let in to the city of Alba. That becomes pretty clear. But they've also gone through so much together that suggests that there are different ways of coming to positions of leadership, and there are different ways of honoring the gods. So there's a sense of a greater open-mindedness coming from these two, which Rome kind of likes the idea of about itself in its own definition over time. So I see it as being in service to the way that Romans like to think about ancient Rome in that respect.
Where I think this is also kind of acting as a tool for like sort of Italian myth making in modern Italy, and really imagining Rome as an international city or a destination for refugees and migrants and immigrants and things like that.
Yeah. I was also thinking of like, it was really interesting how they were introducing the concept of Xenia without like specifically saying that, because it is the Greek potter and his family who accepts both Numitor and Sylvia.
I read him as an Evander analog, but maybe that was just me.
Well, but also, and then accepts all of the children of Rumia, and like there wasn't ever, I was expecting a lot more of a fight over that or something, but no, it was very much of like, no, this is what we need to do, and it did play into that. The reason you do that is because what if it's a god in disguise, and you don't want to take that chance. So and the gods seem to be doing this.
You reminded me of something that I could not figure out in my researches and preparation for this show, which is, why is Numitor blinded, and why is he blinded in that way? I was I'm so confused by the metal band RoboCop thing that he had going on.
I wrote it down as Iron Age Cyclops from the X-Men, but that was how I wrote it.
I love that hairband because it's like he doesn't have eyes, but the actor does need to see, so we need to put some little slits in that. So just so we can keep going and not have to do that makeup all the time, maybe.
I was just so confused because I was like, surely there are easier ways of blinding somebody than doing this. And also, I don't know why they had to blind him.
I'm going to take a swing and just say it's an Oedipal thing, right?
That's what I was thinking,
old man exile and make him blind. It's part of the toolbox.
It looked cool. I don't know.
It was very emotional, but I was like, this just seems unnecessary. Like, if you're going to blind him in this way as an old man and then send him out to live as an exile, you may as well just kill him. Like, he's not going to survive.
Would it cauterize? I mean, because like you are burning the eyes, so maybe that's the idea, as opposed to cutting them. That's the only other semi-logic I can throw
suppose
at
that
it.
makes sense. But I
this
guess I was
feeds
thinking
into the
more
bigger
like,
issue of kings, though, where you have people who are kings and are deposed, and there is good suggestion throughout the source material that we do have that you can be deposed and then be put back. And that's definitely what happens to Numitor. Sure.
Yeah.
But this is not seems to be how it's going to play out here. And once you're deposed because the gods. And then it's like, well, what's your line of succession? And it's like, where's Sylvia's husband? Where's the dad?
He's dead, right? Because they go to the tomb of their father.
He's sparsely mentioned. Which I wonder
he's
is
kind of a great warrior. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't even know if he's named, which I imagine is kind of because you mentioned, I forget who said it, but that the role of Romulus and Remus's mother gets kind of divvied up among these various characters in the show. And that's kind of this consequence of that, where it's like their mother is going to be Sylvia, but if they're not going to be the actual sons of Mars, well, then who is their dad? And then they just kind of like, anyways.
But speaking of Sylvia, she does have an interesting role in this, which I think ties into some more modern Italian ideas of family, but also hints at the sort of powerful place that women can have in patriarchal societies when they're given permission to speak. There's all of a sudden this moment where Numitor is like, you be my voice. And it's like, because he's kind of a little bit too sick to get to the Council of the Kings. And she goes in there and she does not weave a story the way that Numitor would weave a story. She weaves a story that's really centered around motherhood and the way that her sons need to be either found, rescued, or the real killer discovered and dealt with. And she turns it into this thing where she's like, well, now I have this opportunity. This is what it's going to be. And she uses that influence throughout the rest of the season to sort of try to turn Wiros in particularly onto different paths. And also a little bit with Yamos as well when he's finally found. So I think there's an interesting sort of modern parallel to the idea of the mother and what she represents within the family that is playing out here.
You mentioned the intense stares between Yemos and Wiros, but she does kind of become like a mother-in-law type figure to Wiros, where, you know, she has her position or relationship to him is a little, I don't even know the word, how I describe it. There's a little bit of friction there.
Oh, yeah.
There is. But she does, with the way that she handles the whole Yamos situation, it does remind me of what the Romans would consider a good mother to be by the time we get to like the Republic and that sort of thing, where she's concerned about protecting his opportunities in life and promoting his prominence within his community and like safeguarding it when he can't. You know, she steps in when it's appropriate and then steps back when he's capable of handling himself. But her prime concern is always his prospects.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, the one other interesting thing about mothers and the representation of Wiros and Yamos is that Yamos by the end claims he has 2 mothers. And Wiros is like, I have no mothers. Even though he, like, at the same time is acknowledging in some ways that, like, he is where he is because maybe Rumia did this, but he only claims it when it's convenient for him. But I think it's really easy to see how he's going to get drunk on his own power, basically.
Yeah.
Watch this space.
I love the idea of the 2 mothers, though, because that is very much the impression that we get from, you know, the myths that come through, that obviously there's the woman that gave birth to Romulus and Remus, whatever her name is, let's call her Sylvia for simplicity. And then there is the she-wolf. You know, whether you think it is actually a wolf, whether you think it's a wolf acting on behest of, you know, the potential father Mars, whether you think it is the wife of the shepherd who allegedly found the twins, or whether you think it is, you know, whatever you think it is, it is this idea of having the 2 mothers. And so I do kind of like that representation of it.
So we're hitting about the hour and a half mark, which is wild. So I think I would say that we're probably about time we can start thinking about closing thoughts. But is there any sort of last thoughts that anyone has that they didn't get out that they want to get out?
I just mentioned that ancient Velia is nowhere near where we are geographically in this story.
I was going to wonder about that because they say they're going to go over and live in Velia, but like there's still people in. Also, Velia is not Rome. Velia is its own other place. Whatever.
Yeah, I was looking at the map in your book. Just be like, where's Velia? And
Velia is not on that map.
It is not on this map.
Velia is down in the province of Salerno, so South Campania, essentially.
Oh,
so
yeah.
A long way south, and it was a coastal city, and it was known for its trading routes in the 5th century, but it's certainly not where we would be locating any of the action of this series. So it's interesting. They've picked sort of ancient names, and some of them are close by and some of them aren't. So there's a mention of Anxur as one of the cities of the 30 kings. That's reasonably close by. That's very doable. But the idea that they're going to go into Velia, rename it Ruma, and rule there because it's currently kingless seems to be a bit of a big ask. And so there is a little bit of fiction going on with that as well. So the idea that the death of Spurius, the previous king of Velia, has created this power vacuum that Wiros and Yamos could step into and rule is an interesting one. So yeah, I think I'll leave it there.
They did kill off quite a bit of at least the young men. Like quite a few of them did make it. So honestly, they should probably just go there for the women. It's like, listen, you're missing a lot of men now. So
they're ladies part of the class, though. I don't. Yeah.
So I think I've just thought of a final question for our guests, maybe that we could end on. I should have prepped it myself, but I was thinking, since we have you here and since we've been talking kings of Rome, I wanted to go around and sort of pull the room. Is who's your favorite king of the 7 canonical kings of Rome?
That's easy. Mine is Servius Tullius, who, interestingly, much like Wiros, is the slave who became a king.
My favorite is Numa. And I know we've drawn a little bit of a parallel to Numa and Wiros here, but I have always read Numa as very much in the philosopher king model. He doesn't seem to be a deceptive character, but he certainly is leaning pretty hard on the religious aspect. And maybe to do that would require some deception. But that's not necessarily the idea that ever comes through in the ancient source material. He's sort of seen as this great lawgiver and great giver of like rituals related to priestly duties on his special tablets and stuff that he buries with himself. And you're like, all right. Everybody must just nobody must read the secret documents.
I like Servius because he seems to stand up for the people. Yeah. In a limited respect. He also kind of screws them over, but I like the fact that he seems to resist elite power in at least some respect, which is more than I can say for most of the other kings of Rome.
Yeah, there's some brutal characters in there.
I was about to say, my boy Tarquinius Superbus.
Look, way to cause trouble.
Is he the one that throws Servius Tullius down the flight of stairs? Or okay, I like that move. Just throwing an old man down a set of stairs. That's a great way.
It's
to
a very
be king.
problematic one. Well, with the problematic son, and things go south. Is that right?
Yes.
Correct.
Yes. Okay. I would probably say that one because his story was so bonkers. Admittedly, everything I learned about the Seven Kings, I mostly learned from reading this book. So,
that's the perfect.
Oh, we are
segue.
honored.
It really is. Yes. So, if you have not read Rex, the Seven Kings of Rome from the Partial Historians, you should totally get that. And we have awesome news that we'll let Dr. Rad and Dr. G share as well. Go ahead and tell us about your next book.
Absolutely. We have a new book coming out. It is a bit more of a popular history, I think, than Rex, the Seven Kings of Rome. So it's probably, much like this series, is probably a pretty good introduction for people that don't know much about archaic Rome. Our book is meant to be a bit of an introduction to people who are maybe less familiar with Roman society. It's called Your Cheeky Guide to the Roman Empire, and it covers a huge variety of topics. We tried to make sure there was something on every single period. So you will see a bit of King Numa in there, but you'll also see things like aqueducts.
Excellent.
Love our aqueducts.
Very importantly, a whole part on aqueducts.
Yeah. It was very highly requested. I didn't understand it, but apparently aqueducts have a huge fan base out there that needs to be satisfied.
I think it's Life of Brian, right? Life of Brian did that. They gave us
Quite possibly, yes.
I'm a big stand for bathing just generally. Western Life Thermae Romae was kind of was top of my list the past year. I love baths, and you can't have baths without clean water. So yay, aqueducts.
Exactly. Yeah.
I feel like this,
and
this
that
is going
should
to be.
Sorry.
I was going to segue into this show is brought to you by by our sponsor, Aqueducts.
Get cleaner
Thank
water
you so
now.
much for the fresh water. It's been delicious.
Yeah. But that book should be available in, I think, most bookstores in North America and also through Amazon. I believe there will be an ebook version. So
coming your way, November.
Yeah. And if listeners want to read or see or hear more from you, where can they find you on the internet?
Oh, you should look up The Partial Historians and just put that into the internet or whichever place that you listen to podcasts, and we'll come up straight away. There's so many episodes where nearly at the end of the 5th century.
Yeah, nearly there, yes.
Nearly.
Yes. But much like Yemos and Enitos, we have matching bracelets and two halves of a whole.
Excellent.
Which is which? Oh, no.
Oh.
Yes, which of you is the Remus?
We'll find out. Everybody will learn on air.
There we go.
I've always said it's very concerning that Dr. G likes Romulus and Augustus. I feel that makes me the unnecessary one.
It would be a hell of a way to end your show. How true, art imitates life if one of you just murdered the other one on mic.
Yeah, we'll just segue into the true crime podcast genre. I mean,
there
we being a generous term. But
yeah, you have to recreate the crossing over of the sacred wall furrow
it's
thing.
when one
somehow.
of you reaches over the other one's mic stand or something.
That's right.
Wow. We'll keep the suspense going for as long as possible on that one, I think.
Yeah, we've got a while before we finish the story of Rome, so.
This is not admissible in court. So. Dr. G, Dr. Rad, thank you so much for joining us. We loved having you on the show. We hope you had a good time with us.
We
Thank
did.
you so
Thank
much
you
for
so
having
much.
us.
Excellent. Listeners, as usual, you can find us on movieswedig.com as well as most major streaming services. Follow us on social media as well, and we will be back soon. Christy, do you know what's next in the after this one?
Those About to Die.
Oh, we will be returning with Those About to Die. Get your Anthony Hopkins fix. All right, thank you again, and we will see you around. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.